Hey everyone, this is a PhD talk with Jonathan Bill Doe, and he's one of my colleagues at the Technology Institute, and he's doing a very interesting PhD about urban gardening in Ghana, which is where he's from. But we talk mostly in this one about another project he did. He has like a lot of different degrees from Ghana and now also from here, a master's in heritage. And some of you probably know I also work in areas of thinking about cities and heritage and phenomenological heritage and so on. So this is more from that side of things, but it's really interesting to think about sustainability in the way that Jonathan does. So I hope you enjoy this talk. Okay. Hi, Jonathan. So good to see you. Thanks for doing this today.
Hello, Andrea. Yeah, good to see you too.
So I want to start with talking about your master's project, but you're now a PhD working on another very interesting project, which we'll get to. So this is towards a PhD talk, but the paper that kind of caught my interest is based on your master's, and it's called Keta Lagoon, Uncovering Suppressed Heritage Practices for Sustainable Wetland Management. Hope I got that right. You can correct me if I didn't. So I guess just to start, maybe we could just learn a little bit about you. I know you studied philosophy of history at the University of Ghana, and then you got an MA in Museum and Heritage Studies before you did this master's, which is focused around the Keta Lagoon. So I guess I would just like to hear about that process, where you're from and studying in Ghana and then coming to Germany to do this.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. You did a bit of digging on the internet. I come from Ghana. Yes, first degree was in philosophy. And in Ghana, you have the option of minoring, which means you do less, coursework on another subject.
Oh,
And in my case, it was history. So I would say that I minored in history and majored in philosophy.
okay.
And so that was my first degree. And then after that, I did a bit of tour guiding for a couple of years. And so, and you must be aware also that Ghana has at least two sites on the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Yeah, and so I took visitors to those places and used my undergraduate knowledge and history to interpret, the history and the culture to people. And so I got more and more interested in, this museum and heritage stuff. And so that was when I moved to the archaeology department in University of Ghana, which has a program in MA in Museum and Heritage Studies. So that's why I did that.
So what were you doing the tour guide and interpretation and things? Was it at the UNESCO Heritage Site or?
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, so what I did, it was like a freelance tour guiding. So I signed up with a couple of agents in Ghana. And so as and when they had visitors, they would call me up, give me an itinerary, and we have a driver. And then we hit the road and follow the itinerary. I do the interpretation and so on. But there are on-site tour guide who also did the talking or interpreted that, yes. But in between, while we were on the road, a lot of interesting things to see. So I interpreted those ones. And if they have sites that we visited, yes, I interpreted those ones also to them based on my knowledge. So the M in archaeology department, further deepened my understanding and, museum and heritage studies. Yes, still I was not satisfied. So I got more curious about what is this UNESCO World Heritage in the stuff. So I started digging, and that's where I landed at BTU to
So
do
like a true
MA.
philosopher, you were questioning and looking deeper and
Yeah, well, yeah, sounds like that. So that's how come I came to you and did the coursework for the MA in World Heritage. And
Because I guess
whilst
if you just search online for UNESCO heritage programs, BTU is probably one of the ones to come up, maybe one of the only ones. So it makes sense that you would find that if you were looking around.
right, yeah. Yeah, so whilst I was doing the coursework under the World Heritage program here, then I took a course on philosophy of nature.
Ah,
Well, in
a very good course, yes. Mhm.
yeah, so I got more and more interested, and that's when my MA project shifted to the Keta Lagoon. Then I was looking at the history, cultural stuff connected to the Keta Lagoon, and also how does that or did that interact with the Ramsar conventions,
Mhm.
and especially how the scientists or the ecologists who worked on the site and drew management plan for the site engaged the cultural and the historical values of the people and the lagoon. So that's how come that was how my project came up.
Well, it's really interesting for me. I wonder, had you spent time at the Keta Lagoon beforehand? And like, what was your experience of it before? How did you think about this particular area?
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Actually, I grew up there.
Oh,
Yeah, I grew up. So if you look at the Keta Lagoon on the map, it's between the Atlantic Ocean. Or Keta itself is between the Atlantic Ocean and the Keta Lagoon. It's a land stream in between the two water bodies.
it's the
So
biggest wetland in
yes,
Ghana?
exactly.
Okay.
Yes. So sometimes I pride myself of growing up on an island.
Ah,
Yeah. So you walk a few kilometers, you are either on the other side of the water body that as the Atlantic Ocean, and
hmm.
then the opposite side, the northern side, and there is the Keta Lagoon. So I interacted with that growing up. Yeah, so and then for the MA project, then by then I had specific questions in mind. And so I went there to interact with some of the knowledge holders quite a bit, and that informed
That's an
my
important
project.
term, knowledge holders. But before we get into that, I wonder when you were doing your tour guide stuff and your interpretation, if you were noticing already that there were certain suppressed kind of heritages or if some of the themes that you end up exploring in the master were already part of that questioning. I mean, were you seeing that maybe the way the visitors came or the way it was presented by people who weren't from the area, who weren't knowledge holders in the way that you mean, was different from those who were knowledge holders, or had those themes kind of come to mind already?
Yeah, I would say that it was, I became more and more aware of them in in the history, in the history course.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes you grow up in an area, you don't question a lot of things,
Mm-hmm.
but um, by the time we were taking the history course, a lot of debate had gone on about decolonization, colonization, and so on and so forth. So some of those readings were present in our history class.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, Regrettably, going back to high school or secondary school, as we call it, yeah, not much of it was present in our readings. So I became more aware of this suppressed nature of the knowledge holders and their knowledge and history,
Mm.
more in the history class.
Okay. I was going to
So
ask you if in your philosophy, if you'd had what we might call African philosophy or African. You sent me this great paper, which I'm going to link to. And in that paper, he talks about in his education, which was a lot earlier than yours, I'm assuming, that he didn't have any of kind of what you're talking about now. I mean, you're talking about it in heritage, but of the African perspective or African philosophy. It was more Western philosophy. So I wonder, when you studied philosophy, was there more of that, or was it the same kind of Western curriculum that he talks about in that paper?
Yeah. I think it was a blend. It was a blend of both world, and also most of the African, philosophers like Wedu, Jechi, Kwame Jechi, and so on. Yeah, they had a specific, goal, and the goal was basically to question their own culture and also question the Western, philosophy and so on. So it's, one would say, it's a blend of this world is
Okay.
what they were articulating as African philosophy.
So for example, the paper you sent me, did you read that in school? Would have been part of what you were learning?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
there was already, yeah, this talk about which, yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out if it was like the philosophy and the history are connected. I mean, they're connected even in your paper. I was started thinking a lot about how the ways we think and the philosophies we build have a lot to do with the actions that we sustain and the ways that
Mhm.
we sustain them. So they're not disconnected, but I wonder in your school, before we get to the paper, that if it was already like, so these were the same kind of things in philosophy and in history. Were they connected, or was it different writers or different ways of looking at it? Or
Yeah, different writers.
okay.
Yeah, different writers. Um, because the educational system has in most often, followed the Western structure. And then the divisions in the knowledge system also were very present even up to now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the debates about humanities and the sciences and so on. And I guess the benefit that we had out of those kinds of debate was that they introduced what they call core subjects in the secondary school or the high school. So if somebody who was on the science track, doing the pure sciences, chemistry, physics, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
there was a common course, called social studies. Then there you had a bit of opportunity to look into sociology, and then they had a bit of history. But by then, the historians were quarreling with that. The history lesson be subsumed in
Mm.
sociology. So there was that thing that what was called core subjects. And so um, the division was sharper even at the university level, because the University of Ghana was established in 1948. And 1948, Ghana was still under the British colonial system. So the structure was still in place.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in 1957 that Ghana gained independence. And that's where the emergence of African philosophers who were questioning their own culture and the Western, culture, began to articulate their views into
Mm-hmm.
their writing and so on. So the historians were different from the philosophers. But what was key to the African philosophers was that they will go to already written bodies of knowledge like anthropology, history, and begin to take concepts, practices, from there, and then to do their conceptual clarification and questioning, from there. So they were not actually historians, but they were using very much historical sources. They were using linguistic sources, to extract, the concepts and practices and articulate African philosophy. And also using very much Western, language and in some cases.
Yeah, language is a really important thing. And as I was, yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you said. It's really interesting because in the paper you sent and your paper too, there's always this interplay between looking back at history and then and within the history is the practice and the thinking in a way of the philosophy. So I can see there's two different approaches in the way you said, but then it seems very hard to completely disentangle all of that because you know better, but I'm imagining this. So you have this colonial college, university, and these kind of set ways, these systems, these paths that people are following, and then people start questioning them, but they haven't really thought about all these other historical paths that, of course, are there and important and influencing, but maybe haven't been had, like, people haven't focused on them and written about them and created all this literature about them, or had they? I don't know. It's kind of, was it a time where everyone had to sort of rewrite their own histories in a way in terms of what was externally represented? Of course, their histories as lived are different, but in terms of what's externally represented.
Mhm. Yeah, I think on that front, there are two shifts in the historical writing. The first was more or less a response to the colonial history and what some of British historians were saying about African history, because the forms of writing, um, it's, to use Roman letters, uh,
Yeah, the
and
language
then
itself.
leave document and so on and so forth. This was very, typical, understanding of the British philosophers. And so standing on that, they said that Africans, Africans had no history until they had contact with Europeans. And, because it was through the Europeans that Africans learned how to write and so on. So the history, those kinds of writing and so on, what will now become of those things will be what they will call history or recognize as history. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then the Africans who were trained as historians, also responded to that. Yeah, one of the interesting thing one of them said was that, Herodotus was recognized as the father of history in the Western canons. Yeah, but what Herodotus was doing really was collecting oral histories or oral stories from people. So if Africans can also write or collect their own oral, then that should also be recognized as history. Yeah.
Oh,
So
I love that. That's very interesting. It also relates a lot to the language part of all of this, and also this dynamic aspect that is talked about in that paper of the differences, right, between these kinds of learning styles and philosophies. And yeah, I really like that that was brought up. And also that, yes, I mean, that's Herodotus is kind of what we look to in this Western canon, but there could have been many other people there doing the similar thing, right? And saying similar things and even expressing that as their language. It's just that it hasn't been,
yes.
canonized.
Yeah, yeah. And so the other shifts in the historical writing was more or less about nation. Here, and if you take Ghana, for example, and the same thing applies to most African countries, it's more or less a collection of ethnic groups. And all these ethnic groups can also be recognized as states because they have their own chiefs and their own protocols, practices, and so on. In some cases, they are sharply different from other ethnic groups. So here was a moment in 1957 and the 1960s for the rest of the African countries. And then the president who emerged unite all these ethnic groups in the form of what was or what can be said to be a European state or a European nation. So then the history had to be told or written in a way that would unite, the people. And there they use, they use the museums, and so on and so forth. And I think if you read Laura Jane Smith, that's what she sometimes called authorized heritage, discourse. Yeah, although I have some differences on that, but that takes us away from what we are discussing. So these were two shifts in the historical right in African history.
So I'm trying to, so you grew up in this area, which I didn't know. So this is very interesting in the area that you wrote about. And all of these themes are part of this paper and of your work and your ongoing work. So I'm trying to imagine you're growing up there and you're part of, I mean, like it's your life. And at some point, I guess, in the way that philosophy does, we turn our attention on our own life. But you're doing this in a really particular way with the Keta Lagoon. I wonder, like, a little bit about that process for you. What was it like to start to think of that area that you knew so well from a perspective of writing about it academically through all these lenses? Was it kind of easy for you to do, or yeah, I don't know. What was it like?
Yeah, the starting was easy. Yeah, because I knew there was something to be said. But again, one has to touch on a bit of the colonial history, and that's where we may tease out the suppression, because there were the colonial authorities had to devise certain ways to rule the people or to govern the people, one form was direct rule, where there was a British colonial officer or commissioner at a local area instructing the people as to what to do and what not to do. But they were understaffed, so they could not do that all over the place. And then they came up with another strategy, which was indirect rule. So there, what they did was to identify certain leaders in the respective community or ethnic groups, and then rule through them. And these leaders, in most cases, were chiefs. But like I said earlier, it's not homogeneous. And not all ethnic groups or communities had chiefs. And in some areas, they had priests, who are priests of the land or the river and so on and so forth. And that was their leader. But in the indirect rule system, the thinking was that there must be a chief. And so where there was none, they had to empower somebody to be the leader. And then that starts the distortion. Mm-hmm. So the knowledge, the connection to water body, the land, and so on. Then the local now had to struggle to find a way. But there was this dominant, presence of the British colonial authority empowering one over the other. So for me, that's where the form of suppression started. So now I knew there was something to engage, but where do you trace it? That's where the difficulty was, especially when I read the management plan for the lagoon.
So for people who don't know about the heritage, so what was, I mean, could you explain what, just like very briefly, so that had it been designated as a heritage site, or what was happening? Yeah.
Yeah, so Keta Lagoon was designated or is designated as a Ramsar site.
That was in like the 80s, right? 1988 or something. Or
yes,
no?
Yes.
Or some,
yeah.
okay.
I think till 1988 or so.
Yeah.
But the management plan and the research, took off significantly from 1991. That's when the ecologists and the natural scientists got involved to do research on the lagoon.
So you kind of have this Western presence coming in and saying this is going to be a heritage site. I mean, is that fair to say? Is that how it felt? I mean, this is like you were just being born and stuff probably, but for the area around, yeah, I guess I'm just trying to give people an idea who don't understand. It's coming from people working there, but it's also being imposed in a way, right? So how would
Exactly.
you explain that?
Yes. So Ramsar Convention has practices or articles, the that people working there have to observe.
Right. Because all heritage sites sort of have these rules and so
Yeah.
on. And then this convention in particular. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So in this case, it's what we call the state party. So the state, which is now what that was formed after independence with political leaders and so on and so forth. They had to appoint, managers and so on to take care of this. And I think it's still the case. Now it's under a ministry, that hosts wildlife, resources. So, and most of the people who end up in these offices with the states are trained in the natural sciences and so on. So they become caretakers of this water body and then the surrounding areas. So that is quite distinct from the local people, although some of them may be part of or come from the local community and so on. Yeah. So, but it's quite distinct.
And this is all probably very complicated because it could seem, I mean, there's a lot of what would, I guess, might seem like good things coming in terms of maybe jobs or attention or something to the area, but those could also be bad things. And yeah. So
yeah. So I was reading their management plan. Then they had a column where they talked about local community participation. So I took a look at it. And then, given the history that was present in my mind and I experienced, so I began to ask, what's the role of these people that I know of? So that I can understand. First of all, given the nature of the structure, where most scientists are not exposed to the cultural, sociology, and the history of the country, or they are trained purely in the natural science, I can understand why local participation would just mean the people who are readily available to take part in the management plan. So that's, for me, it's where the suppression, well, although sometimes I struggle if I should use the word suppression.
Yeah, we can talk about that word, but that's powerful what you just said. Because I think actually I wanted to read the very first sentence of your paper, of the one that was published in 2022, and it's current efforts to integrate heritage practices in the sustainable management of wetlands in post-colonial nation states assume that these practices have always existed in the forms they are now. So I think with what you just said and that sentence, we get into a really interesting place because it's not that people are necessarily trying to overlook things or assume things. I mean, that's kind of what an assumption is. But what you just said struck me because there's even within this kind of model that we were talking about, it's almost like participation itself means something to the people who have written those rules. And it doesn't necessarily mean participation at this level of actually understanding what the practices are and what the heritage is, and that should be conserved. It's almost like that's getting imposed, but people don't realize it, right? There's some very weird disconnect going on there that's very meaningful, I think.
Yes,
Assumption, that word for some reason stands out.
yes, exactly. Yeah. So having the depth to go beyond the surface to encounter these knowledge holders, it's I think a methodological problem for especially for those who are trained in the natural sciences. And also because the nature of the colonial engagement, most of them had lost a lot of their power.
Mm.
And if I should say, maybe their relevance, direct relevance, to the people. By the time we came up to independence, so there are layers and levels of the suppression which are not directly obvious to people. Yeah.
Even to the people themselves who are being suppressed, which makes it even harder, I guess. And yeah. But maybe we can talk about sort of what you were trying to do or what you did do in your master's. So I know it's kind of impossible to summarize a master's in a sentence or something, but maybe we can make it a little personal. So I feel like you noticed there was something going on there. We don't know what to call it yet. Suppression is probably, we can talk about what that really means, but assumptions that were holding things down, right? Keeping things from being seen,
Mhm.
that, as you point out in the paper, actually could be really productive for the goals of the whole heritage project, like the wise use principle, which you talk about, or the very idea of sustainability itself. So there's this weird thing going on, which you point out in the paper, where or your thesis too, but this paper where there's a desire to sustain heritage and to be sustainable. And doing that is somehow not actually noticing that there were already practices that are the heritage that were sustainable. So it's very strange, but maybe you can unpack it a little of like what you kind of had in mind or.
Yeah, well, I think you've articulated it very well. Yeah, but so let me just touch a bit on the Ramsar Convention and then come back to that point. So the Ramsar Convention itself was established in 1971. So 20 years after, that's 1992, they recognized that cultural practices and, knowledge holders and so on that live close to the water body should be part of the management. So at the international level itself, there was that recognition. Now, what I'm now discovering is, how then to get to the roots of these people that have these intricate knowledge systems connected to the water body and elevate that into the management plan that would attain the sustainability that is so much desired. So this is what the problem is. So first of all, there's a recognition that is relevant, but then how to get to the root of this? Yeah, it's where the
Which we've
issue.
already touched on a few of
Yeah,
the difficult layers. I mean, the language, the history, the change in power, all of this. There's so many factors there.
yeah.
And then this idea of the wise use principle, maybe we should talk about that a little bit, because the example that you give in the paper towards what we've been discussing is a fishing practice, which I won't even dare try to say, Atsidza or
Atsidza,
Atsidza,
Atsidza.
Atsidza.
Yeah,
So, but before we get to that, maybe we need to set up a few things like what a knowledge holder is, and well, I don't know. What do you think? Or should we just dive in to how that's an example?
yeah. Well, what I mean there basically is I have a specific example of these knowledge holders. For example, a diviner, you know. So if or a fortune teller, these are things that are embodied. And in most cases, they make an appeal to, you know, non-physical things.
Now, that's different from the priests and the discussion about Because one very interesting part in all of this is the way that the lagoon, the sort of male and female um, deity that it was or is, and how this was kind of completely overlooked. And that these, you call them priests, I think, in the paper. I'm not sure.
Yes.
But these people weren't consulted at all or like brought into the process at all. Or, I mean, it's like not even recognized. And it's the body of water. So, yeah. Is that relative to this or is this something else, what you're talking about now?
Yes, it's relative to that. Yeah. So there were priests, and then a diviner as well. So they all played, or played different roles. Um, they played different roles at different times of the year.
Mm.
Yeah. So I can talk about the diviner or the, yeah,
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 as you wish. It's just, I was just trying to
yes.
ground it that it's a very essential, I guess. Isn't it? You can't not really, I don't know, what would you say? I'm putting words on things, but I imagine that the heritage of the people themselves coming up there, that this is, in terms of the knowledge of the place that it holds, you wouldn't be able to separate these, what you're talking about, whether it's the diviner or the priest from it. However, in the way that it was, the way that it has been um, bureaucratized or whatever, none of this was represented. But maybe you can better unpack that a little bit. Like how important is this for the people who are in this area historically?
Okay. Yeah. Historically, it was important, but in contemporary times, um, a lot of power has been taken away from them. Yeah, but so my point is, if Ramsar says things that this is important, and of which I share, yeah, then we need to find a way to bring them back and give them more visibility. So, for example, if there is a problem, somebody is sick or what have you, or something that um, no one or nobody can find an immediate explanation to, they go to these places, the diviner, to inquire what the issue um, is that they cannot understand. And they also have festivals. And in that festival calendar, the diviner also plays a role in determining certain things about deities, about how people have to regulate themselves, and so on and so forth. Now, so those ideas or suggestions that can come out of that practice, how then do they come up in regulating the lagoon? How then do they come up in the management plan? Is where I'm trying to get at. And that is why I think it's relevant and can be, sustainable. But there is also a very competing, idea or practice, which is Christianity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
majority, as of now, majority are Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
And that's
there,
related to the colonial times too. So it's even more, it's complicated about how to disentangle that.
yes. So, but some becoming more and more aware, especially when you take the decolonial philosophy, philosophical project, questioning, these and are finding accommodation, between the two, systems. And so that kind of decolonial project that paves the way to bring in the suggestions and practices and the knowledge that these diviners embody into the contemporary, management of the lagoon.
Okay, this is really fascinating and kind of hard to hold. It's one reason I wanted to talk to you because it's kind of this beyond dichotomy thing, right? Because we usually think of this as either or, like in the paper you talk about that you gave me, one of them, that there's this notion of historical and modern that's very important, but we don't often think of it like that. It's more like, okay, there must be people living in this area who still have all of these practices and still are completely 100% following along with the diviners and the priests, and they don't know about the other. Or there's Christians who are completely modern. And in truth, as is pointed out in your paper and the one you sent me, it's always kind of a mix, right? People might be aware of both and using them in different ways. Also, there's this whole historical suppression, or whatever we want to call it, assumption that's guiding. And the more people become aware of it, the more things change. So it doesn't have to be an either or. It could be a dialogue that grows into something better, which I think is what you're kind of expressing. And a lot of African writers that, some of the ones you've talked about are trying to express this, right? But isn't it hard because people want to either do one or the other? Like, okay, it must be that it's the old ways of doing things and that's the right way and we can only do that, or it's the modern way. Or have you felt that tension of how to talk about, like, open that space to everything?
Yes, I've felt that, and it's also very present in the contemporary issues as well. But if we have to carry out the project of sustainability forward, and if we think that the cultural practices of people are relevant or they can offer us something, then we need to engage that very seriously. And in African philosophy, there are two more ontologies that most African philosophers have consensus on. So one is that human beings are relational. And that's where one of the African philosophers turned Descartes, around. I think, therefore I am, right? So yeah, so he turned it around.
I am, and then therefore I think, or I have the potential to think, or something.
Yeah. I am because we are. Yeah, so not I think, therefore I am. I am because we are.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wow.
Yes. So that changed, or subverts the Western philosophy in a way. So if we have to carry out this sort of relationality of human beings and accept the mutuality of human beings, and then it elevates the philosophical concept and ideas that these knowledge holders embody. And if that finds expression into efforts of sustainability, then we are a step forward, because that provides a perspective to question what the international bodies have always underpins their sustainability thinking. Because most often, if you think about sustainability, you're talking about economics. And economics is thought of in individual terms and profit making and so on and so forth. So this idea that I am because we are, provides a perspective to question this economics of profit making, of maximizing profit wherever you can find it, at the expense of the environment. And the African philosophers also find a consensus with the idea that Africans relate to human beings, yes, but they also relate to the environment in a very unique way, or relate to the non-humans in very unique ways. So to the African, I think the paper, Redu's paper, yeah, he touched on the view that, yeah, water bodies and some water bodies are deities, or they have spirits behind them. The they believe that there is a logical distinction between present humans, the departed humans, the ancestors. But all these logical distinctions are in a continuum. So, yeah, we are not only trying to sustain the environment or water body for the present generation, but to a future generation.
Mm.
And in doing so, you're also to what the ancestors have also left. So these two ontologies, provide a perspective on sustainability and the underpinning economic assumptions in sustainability as crafted in the international conventions.
I love this, what you're saying, because it speaks to what I think of as like nestedness, right? Which is what I was trying to get at too with that not either or, like there's all these scales, right? That we can still learn from our own heritage, for example. And what heritage is can still be learned. And I really love this I am because we are. I think now is a good time to think about that wise use thing, which is like this wise use principle, which is that it should be for the benefit of humankind in a way that's compatible with like maintaining the site such that it's it's good for the ecosystem or something like that. I can put it in the show notes, the actual thing, but it's mostly the sustainability thing. When you talk about too, like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think number 14 and 17 you bring up, that like what we're trying to do with this whole practice that we talked about, these people coming in and preserving the site, has to do with this sustainability. So what we want to do is what you're describing is look at this nestedness of history and peoples and so on. And the way that you present a possibility of doing this is through this fishing practice, which you can say the word again. I already forgot. Atskita.
Achija.
Say it again.
Achija.
Achida.
Achija.
Achija.
Yeah.
So what is that? And maybe then we can look at that as an example of this, because I think everything we've been talking about from both sides, right? From whoever are the suppressors and whoever are the suppressed, or whoever the assumers and whoever are the ones who are having things assumed about them, which is always a dynamical, changing, nested thing. But through this example, we can begin to see how it benefits everyone in a way, in the sense that you open up. So first of all, what is this fishing practice in the lagoon?
Well, okay. So it's yeah, so it's Tija, as I've mentioned. It's mainly
Did you see it growing up? I have to ask, by the way.
yes.
Yeah, okay. So it was familiar to you from
Yeah.
beginning. Okay.
Yeah. So many there are, wetland lagoons, so there are trees, all forms of trees that grow around it at the bank. So a fisher would go cut the branches, make them dry a little bit. Then we'll go and dump them, carefully in a certain area. And then use poles, to hold them, together within a certain radius. And then that becomes something like, if I may say that, a house, so to say, for the fish.
Yeah, I'll put a picture of it, or at least link to it, because it kind of is like this little underwater house, and then you have these like little poles, or not little, these poles sort of showing from above water where it is. Yep. Still there? Oh yeah.
Yeah. So these poles hold it, because the lagoon flows, because it is connected to the Atlantic Ocean. So it flows. It has times that it flows, the currents can be quite heavy sometimes. And so the poles hold the branches, together. So after a while, the owner goes, cast a net around it, take the branches out, and then trap the fish there. And then when that is done, bring everything back and then wait for another season.
So this takes like a long time, we should say, because they put all the, it's kind of like just cutting up lots of sticks and then you're putting them underwater and then the fish are like, oh, wow, that looks like a great place to live. And this takes time. So like it's over a year or 2 years, right? That the fish suddenly, they're not like suddenly there. They build their little homes there and it's a whole little ecosystem that is created.
Yeah.
But then
Yes.
all the fish are there. So you have all the fish you could want right there.
Yes.
But it's a time that I bring up time because I think that's an important point. Like it's a different time conception too.
Yes. Yeah. And also when it's time for harvesting them, they have a way of trapping them. They can go, if it's the pile of branches at one spot, they can go a certain distance away and begin to beat the lagoon, sort of hit it, and then the surrounding fish, find a safe haven, and then they get trapped there more. And then that's when they cast the net around it. Yeah.
Poor fish, but hey, at least they're not getting hooks through their mouths and then thrown back in the water.
Yeah. So that reduced the types of signing fishing nets that uses nylon, to fish. And it's a way to also cut down overfishing. Yeah. So that for me is a wise use practice that should be encouraged,
But it has been sort of invisible. I think you used the word invisible. Would you say these are knowledge holders, these fishermen? Fisher people?
I would say,
fisher women and men? I don't know if it's women and men, but.
Yeah, it's predominantly male. Yeah, but there are women also present. Yeah, I would say they are practitioners. They practice that, but I wouldn't say, yes, they embody some form of practice. Yeah, but they are not necessarily the diviners or the priests and so on. Yeah, the diviners and priests, yeah, they can also, or they own, some of those as well. Yeah. Yeah, so that's about the wise use consideration of the Ramsar. But the thing to say very quickly about the Ramsar's wise use consideration is that in my reading, the focus was on birds initially, migratory birds, so the focus was on how to make safe spaces for birds that move from one place to the other, But there again, there are also local beliefs about these birds, which were also not considered. And also, there are some of those spaces that are considered safe havens for the birds. There are also deities there. So if the deities are recognized and incorporated in the management plan, yes, you can be serving the wise use principle of the Ramsar Convention, as well as promoting the local knowledge and belief system as well.
But if you don't know about that, if you haven't somehow opened a discussion about it, then that's that assumption again, right? You talk about the forests too, this happens quite often, I think, that what are considered values or assumed to be kind of universal values that just don't really look at the nuance of what the bird might or might not mean from another perspective. It's more just a giant category of bird that we need to save, or that forests save, instead of understanding that from different positions, what a forest is, first of all, and what a bird is are completely different things, and you can't just lump it all together into a category. So there's just opening that up. It's like opening up different ways of understanding these terms. This again relates to the language, I feel like that's kind of what you're trying to get us to do, to reevaluate almost like our thinking process itself and the assumptions themselves that we're making. What are the assumptions? And then asking, are those true for this particular context?
Yes, exactly. And it goes again into the core of the discipline, the disciplines that are involved um, in the management of these conventions or of sites. And so there, the starting point of Ramsar itself, could be faulted because it was more or less led by natural scientists who were concerned about preserving, safe havens for the birds. So the starting point was a problem. But now it's time for us, like you said, to open this discussion up and incorporate a lot more ideas that can serve different purposes and
Mm-hmm.
in a way going into the sustainability of the water bodies and also for the local people as well.
Because if you think of it in this nested way, scales and everything continuous, and that you can't separate all these things from each other, which is, I think, what both of us are trying to bring up in different ways, then even the goal of preserving birds or creating a safe space for birds actually needs to consider all of this in the long term and the time aspect, because the people who are there, who are that place, are going to be either making this work or not work in the long term, right? And so you can't, like, it's that kind of complex systems effect where everything's affecting everything else. So it's better to take a minute and look at these scales now,
Mm-hmm.
if we really want to have this healthy, wise use future sustainability, because they aren't separate, right? They're all nested together. They're all affecting each other. And I think you
Exactly.
show that with the fishing in a sense, because at least, I mean, maybe I'm even reading into it a little bit, but here we have a kind of wise use practice that already answers a lot of the problems that we deal with in terms of overfishing, the materials that are used, the way the fish are treated, the fish getting completely being gone. But also, in another nested level, it addresses these more philosophical and historical themes that we were talking about. For example, you bring up something with time, but also with the way that we understand ownership, you know. So first
Mm-hmm.
of all, I already talked about the time with the fish and how it's a completely different conception of time, which fits very well with how we really need to think about nature, by the way, and sustainability.
Okay.
So there's a lesson there. But also, we didn't say it yet, but people put up sort of a flag with, I think, like a red or some kind of
Yeah, yeah,
there's a
okay.
way of,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, like there's a way of saying, hey, this is in use, this little community, fish community I've created. And it's beautiful because so long as you're kind of upkeeping that flag, I'll call it, you can correct me, but that that sign, that marker, then the people around know, okay, this is in use and we don't touch it and it belongs to whoever. But if that is left in disrepair or allowed to fall, and as it naturally will, and if no one's using it, and it's just a stick going into the water, it's no pollution, or maybe a flag, then people know, okay, now this area is open for us. We can come use the fish. So it's somehow beautifully kind of um, solving, or at least a different way of addressing some issues of community that also we could learn from, right?
Yeah.
But maybe you could say more about that, or what you think, if that makes sense to you.
Well, yes, you've said it well. Yeah. So it's how time is connected to ownership of a particular space in the commons. If you think of the lagoon as a common that belongs to all the people that are living in the local area,
Mm-hmm.
so you can't say you're going to own a spot in the lagoon in perpetuity. You know. So in that case, time and also the poles as a marker of the portions that you own in the common are indicative of the temporality of the ownership.
It's very
The-
beautiful. I just have to pause for a minute because there's so much talk now about commons, and it's a very important word that I think we're trying to rediscover in this nested way. And that's very important, right? That you have a sense of time and ownership in the sense that you just explained, where just the action itself says this is a temporary caretaking or stewardship or ownership, if you want to use that word, of this space. But even the way it's created, the materials and the signage, everything says it's part of the commons still too, you know. It's very beautiful.
Yes. So, but as soon as the poles, go down, yeah, it's another person can take over. Though the branches are still, there, another person can take over. And human beings, we age, and at some point, yeah, people get older. So your strength also, the strength and ability to do the fishing, also intervene in this time, thinking about time and ownership. So it's now when you can't do it, so the labor of the individual connected to time, also intervene in the ownership. So another person who has strength, younger person, also has time, can then take over. So this is the sort of thinking I was trying to tease, to bring up into the discussion of the common, and also to feed it into the sustainability thinking.
Yeah, I think it is a kind of ecological thinking. I hadn't thought about that. That's true. It is. That's true too, that you're even thinking of human lives as nested, that it's not only one life who's going to be the caretaker, or, you know, we all come and we're strong at some point, and then there's this kind of rhythm, right? This natural rhythm, and that,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's a part of it too. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there would be much more to say about your paper, but I think I'll just let people read it. I think we've given people a good reason to go look at it. But now on your PhD, you're continuing with a lot of these themes, with gardening, right? With, I guess it's like urban gardening in post-colonial Ghana.
Yes.
Maybe you could. So are you now building on some of this too, or just briefly kind of maybe how does the
Yes.
urban gardening fit? Because that's another very interesting subject.
Yes. A lot of some of those ideas are there, but now I'm using them to think through gardening. So the title of my PhD project is Urban Gardening and Sociotechnical Imaginaries in Post-Colonial Ghana. So, I'm thinking about urban gardening, and also looking very much into the past, present, and the future, and the projection, at least from UNESCO's or UN's point of view, is that more and more people will be living in urban centers in the future. And so now, and also the other assumption is that more and more people will be replaced with technology. For example, when I was at the university, yeah, at some point you have to go to the banking hall to cash money or to deposit money. But that has been replaced with ATM. So the one who was collecting the cash, where's the role of that person now? So more and more of that will happen as technology, takes or take some of the roles that human beings do. So for me, what's the ideal thing that we can be doing? So the ideal thing that we can be doing for me is gardening. And so if we think about urban spaces in the future, so it's about, we have to start thinking about how to reserve spaces for gardening in the future. And so in my project, I think about urban gardening differently. Most people are gardening in boxes, little corners and so on and so forth. For me, it's all good, but if that is what some people will be doing in the long term or perhaps for the rest of their life in urban centers, then we have to think about it seriously. And that brings in the discussion we're having about labor, and time.
I was going to ask about that. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm connecting those kinds of thinking also to the urban gardening as well, because it's we need some form of exercise and labor to keep us healthy. And that's the reason why we go to run, we go to walk, and so on. Yeah. Yeah. So if there is a form of gardening that we can exert some of those on, the cultivation, walking to the garden, growing, producing food, and so on. Yeah. Those for me, will include labor. And then we can also bring in the idea of the ownership of that particular space. Time and labor will intervene in who owns that and at what time.
This commons idea.
Yes.
And
yes.
this, I mean, labor means such a different thing to a lot of different people, but yeah, this embodied action, right? Action as knowledge. I feel like there's in the Keta Lagoon, something I really like is you feel that the action is the knowledge, like in the Fisher, in the way we just described time and commons and so on. That's a kind of new way of reconsidering knowledge, maybe even looking back at old knowledges in a different way, but you don't have it without the action. And there's probably something about gardening, especially in cities. I don't know, do people that's like that too, but in Ghana, what's it like? Are there mostly people just growing stuff in their backyard or they're near their, like, what is it like? What are gardens like in Ghana right now?
Yeah, okay. So what explains it more is the sociotechnical imaginaries, because Ghana became an independent nation state 1957. And it took on a socialist project or, a socialist understanding of economics.
Okay.
So there was this mass, broad, big ideas about agriculture, about industry, about manufacturing.
Labor, commons, yeah.
Yes. And so they had all these big ideas, but that has shifted, from the 1970s and 80s. It's tend to be neoliberal, in a sense, yes. So now in the cities, you have a presence of manufacturing companies, some of the old projects that were started, industries that were started in the 1950s, 1960s, there. Now the new wave of neoliberal, enterprises, companies, businesses, and so on are also springing up in the urban areas. And these are competing for space. So the people who are in the urban areas now are struggling to have a place to garden. So what they're now doing, especially for what I call the high tension gardening.
High tension gardening?
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you have say main electricity grid, being transmitted from one place to the other, they have these massive big poles and wires. So that's space. It takes quite a space. Now, so you find that some people, because the law is that people cannot live under that.
Oh, okay.
It's also dangerous to health and so on. Yeah. So that's where some people are now doing that.
Oh, because the space is open.
Yes.
Is there any movement to try to think about gardens as heritage in terms of protection or in terms of making space in the way that, or I don't know, all those words like sustaining, preservation, like, is there anything like that going on?
Not to the best of my knowledge. Yeah, because gardening very much at least in the way I think of it, is much agricultural, thing, much more horticultural thing. So it's not the heritage idea and philosophical ideas are not entering those, spaces or disciplines at the moment. So not, but gardening, yeah. There's also what they call peri-urban agriculture. That's how it's thought of. So it's thought of, producing food, for the urban community and so on. But the thing is that it's people who are making the effort, individuals who are making the effort, also depending on their economic circumstances, to do the planting there. I'm not aware of any government-led effort to consciously reserve such spaces for gardening. Yeah.
That makes me think, of course, of this idea that I talk about, which is like phenomenological heritage, that the lived experience itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
The experience of gardening and of why people would want to go make gardens in that area under the wires, like that to me feels like heritage, right? And not heritage that's in the past, because I think you address this some in your work too. It's living, you're constantly kind of determining what the past, present, and future are, and when you're talking about heritage. So in the case of urban gardening or gardening and what that is for the lived experience, the phenomenology of the people living in the city is actually incredibly important. It's almost like a kind of physical, or you could even think of it as like a mental, physical health issue of heritage in a sense, because yeah, it's really creating something that's going to matter on all levels of heritage, and even, also just of health for the city and for the people. So yeah, it's another one of those things that is nested in a lot of ways that I feel like your work is going to bring out, especially relative to those themes we were already discussing. So I'm looking forward to, I've already gotten a little taste of it, but I'm looking forward to hearing more and seeing your presentation and stuff. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we talk about before we go? I already kept you a little bit longer than I was supposed to, so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, I think we covered it. But maybe one last thing about the gardening.
Mm-hmm.
It's about local beliefs about plants as well. There are also festivals especially that becoming urbanized or in urban areas, that have some plants that feature in the festive occasion, also part of the rituals. Now, some of them grow in the wild. Now, we can't also be thinking about wild spaces in urban areas, especially when you now have the states and companies competing, to get land, and so on. So it's also about connecting the local belief system to the plants and using that to make a case for a space to be reserved for such types of plants to grow, so that there can be continuity of these festivals as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think you gave a presentation way back where you talk about that a little bit in the colloquium, and I really like that part. And I think that's very important for heritage too, that we start to get beyond this human-centric perception of what heritage is. I mean, a city's heritage is not only its human heritage, it's also all the beings that we depend upon and interact with, especially the plants. So yeah, I really like that you have started looking at it. I mean, I remember from some of your work, you're even kind of looking at it from a plant perspective at times. So that's going to be fascinating to read more of, Jonathan. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for the work you're doing. It's cool to talk to you about this. I think we've got even more we should talk about at some point.
Yes, and thank you very much for taking interest in the paper and my work. Yeah, and thanks for all the effort you put in. Yeah, and look forward for more discussions in the future.
Yeah, me too. It was my pleasure. I learned a lot. So thanks.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Have a good day there.
Yeah, same to you.
Bye.
Bye.